talk about the situation right now, what has just taken place, Ukraine now pulling out of Crimea.
Well, I think that what we have seen is a reaction in many respects to a long history of what the Russian government, the Russian president, and many of the Russian people, most of them, feel has been a pattern of American activity that has been hostile to Russia and has simply disregarded their national interests. They feel that having thrown off communism, having dispensed with the Soviet empire, that the U.S. systematically, from the time it started expanding NATO to the east without them, and then using NATO to carry out what they consider offensive actions about against another country, in this case Serbia, a country which had not attacked any NATO member, and then detached territory from it. This is very relevant now to what we're seeing happening in Crimea. And then continued to place bases in these countries to move closer and closer to borders, and then to talk of taking Ukraine, most of whose people didn't want to be a member of NATO, into NATO, and Georgia. Now, this began an intrusion into an area which the Russians are very sensitive. Now, how would Americans feel if some Russian or Chinese or even West European started putting bases in Mexico or in the Caribbean, or trying to form governments that were hostile to us? You know, we saw how we virtually went ballistic over Cuba. And I think that we have not been very attentive to what it takes to have a harmonious relationship with Russia.
Well, Ambassador Matlock, Americans often look at these crises in isolation, and some of the press coverage deals with them that way. But from your perspective, you've argued that we should see the continuum of events that have happened from the Russian point of view. For instance, the Orange Revolution, the pronouncements of some of our leaders several years back, the crisis in Georgia a few years ago, and how the Russians are seeing the original good feeling that most Russians had toward the United States after the collapse of the Soviet Union compared to now.
Yes, that's absolutely true. You see, in the Orange Revolution in Kiev, foreigners, including Americans, who were very active in organizing people and inspiring them. Now, you know, I have to ask Americans, how would Occupy Wall Street have looked if you had foreigners out there leading them? You think that would have helped them get their point across? I don't think so. And I think we have to understand that when we start directly interfering, particularly our government officials, in the internal makeup of other governments, we're really asking for trouble. And, you know, we were pretty careful not to do that in my day. And I recall, for example, when I was being consulted by the newly elected leaders of what was still Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. They were still in the Soviet Union. And they would come to us. We were, of course, sympathetic to their independence. We had never even recognized that they were legally part of the Soviet Union. But I had to tell them, keep it peaceful. If you are suppressed, there's nothing we can do about it. We cannot come and help you. We're not going to start a nuclear war. Well, they kept it peaceful, despite provocations. Now, what have we been telling the Ukrainians, the Georgians, at least some of us officials? Just hold on. You can join NATO, and that will solve your problems for you. You know, and yet it is that very prospect that the United States and its European allies were trying to surround Russia with hostile bases, that has raised the emotional temperature of all these things. And that was a huge mistake. As George Kennan wrote, back in the 90s when this question came up, the decision to expand NATO the way it was done was one of the most fateful and bad decisions of the late 20th century.
I wanted to go to Vice President Joe Biden, who criticized Russia recently during his trip to Lithuania Wednesday.
I want to make it clear. We stand resolutely with our Baltic allies in support of the Ukrainian people and against Russian aggression. As long as Russia continues on this dark path, they will face increasing political and economic isolation. There are those who say that this action shows the old rules still apply. But Russia cannot escape the fact that the world is changing and rejecting outright their behavior.
And in a speech Tuesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin blasted what he called Western hypocrisy on Crimea, saying that the U.S. selectively applies international law according to its political interests.
Our Western partners, headed by the United States of America, prefer in their practical policy to be guided not by international law, but by the right of the strong. They started to believe that they have been chosen and they are unique, that they are allowed to decide the fate of the world, that only they could always be right. They do whatever they want.
Ambassador Jack Matlock, if you could respond to both Biden and Putin.
Well, I think that this rhetoric on both sides is being very unhelpful. The fact is, Russia now has returned Crimea to Russia. It has been most of its recent history in the last couple of centuries been Russian. The majority of the people are Russian. They clearly would prefer to be in Russia. And the bottom line is we can argue till doomsday over who did what and why and who was legal and who was not. I'm sure historians generations from now will still be arguing it. But the fact is, Russia now is not going to give up Crimea. The fact also is, if you really look at it dispassionately, Ukraine is better off without Crimea because Ukraine is divided enough as it is. Their big problem is internal in putting together disparate people who have been put together in that country. The distraction of Crimea, where most of the people did not want to be in Ukraine and ended up in Ukraine as a result of really almost a bureaucratic whim, was, I think, a real liability for Ukraine. Now, we should be concentrating now on how we put Ukraine back together, not we, but the Ukrainians, with the help of the Europeans, with the help of the Russians, and with at least a benign view from the United States. Now, the American president and vice president directly challenging the Russian president and threatening them with isolation is going to bring the opposite effect. All of this has actually increased President Putin's popularity among Russians. Now, you know, most politicians, they like to do things that make them more popular at home. The idea that we are acting, contrary to what Russians would consider their very natural interests, that is, in bringing an area which had been Russian and traditionally Russia for a long time back into Russia. They look at that as a good thing. It's going to be very costly to Russia. They're going to find out in many ways. But to continue all of this rhetoric, I would ask, well, how's it going to end? Oh, what is your objective? Because it isn't going to free up Crimea again or give it back to Ukraine. I think it would be most helpful to encourage the Ukrainians to form a united government that can begin reforms. The proposals before, both by the EU and by Russia, would not have solved their problems. And they're not going to solve the problems by taking, a government that basically represents one half of the country and making it work on the whole country. And all of this interference, both by Russia and by the West, including the United States, has tended to split Ukraine. Now, that is the big issue there, and we need to turn our attention more to it. I just hope everyone can calm down and look at realities and stop trying to start sort of a new Cold War over this. As compared to the issues of the Cold War, this is quite minor. It has many of the characteristics of a family dispute, and when outsiders get into a family dispute, they're usually not very helpful.
Well, Ambassador Matlock, what would you, if you were counseling the president, urge him to do at this stage? Because obviously there are these pretty weak sanctions that have so far been announced. What would your advice be?
Well, I think first of all, we should start keeping our voice down and sort of let things work out. To ship in military equipment and so on is just going to be a further provocation. Obviously, this is not something that's going to be solved by military confrontations. So I think if we can find a way to speak less in public, to use more quiet diplomacy. And right now, frankly, the relationships between our presidents are so poisonous. They really should have representatives who can quietly go and, work with counterparts elsewhere. But fundamentally, it's going to be the Ukrainians who have to put their society back together. It is seriously broken now. And it seems to me they could take a leaf from the Finns, who have been very successful ever since World War II in putting together a country with both Finns and Swedes by treating them equally, by being very respectful and careful about their relations with Russia, never getting into anymore into military struggles or allowing foreign bases on their land. And they've been extremely successful. Why can't the Ukrainians follow a policy of that sort? I think for them it would work too. But first, they have to find a way to unite the disparate elements in Ukraine. Otherwise, these pressures from Russia on the one hand and the West on the other is going to simply tear them apart.
Ambassador, now, on Wednesday,
in the final analysis,
on Wednesday, the head of Ukraine's first national TV was attacked in his office by members of the far-right Svoboda party, including at least one member of parliament who serves on the Parliamentary Committee on Freedom of Speech. The attackers accused the station of working for the Russian authorities after it aired a live broadcast of the signing of the agreement between President Putin and the de facto Crimean authorities. In a video posted online, the attackers are seen forcing the head of the channel to write a resignation letter. Heather McGill of Amnesty International condemned the attack, saying, quote, "The acting Ukrainian authorities must waste no time in demonstrating that basic human rights are protected in Ukraine and that nobody will face discrimination because of their political views or ethnic origin." Ambassador Matlock, can you talk about this attack and the role of these far right-wing parties in the new Ukrainian government?
Well, I'm not intimately informed about all of the details, and I would say that I think Russian media have exaggerated that right-wing threat. On the other hand, those who have ignored it, I think, are making a big mistake. We do have to understand that a significant part of the violence at the Maidan, the demonstrations in Kyiv, were done by these extreme right-wing sort of neo-fascist groups. And they do, some of these, their leaders do occupy prominent positions in the security forces of the new government. And I think the Russians and others are quite legitimately concerned about that. Therefore, many of these things are not nearly as black and white when we begin to look at them as is implied in much of the rhetoric that we're hearing. And I do think that everybody needs now to take a quiet breath, to really look at where we are and to see if we can't find ways by keeping our voices down to help the Ukrainians in present-day Ukraine to get a road to greater unity and reform that will make them a viable state.
Jack Matlock,
and I would argue that they are better off without Crimea.